This orchid pot is almost completely green, but the roots behind that algae may be healthier than you think. So before you repot it, cut roots, change the bark, or move the plant away from the window, there are 7 things I would check first. By the end, you should be able to place your orchid into one of 3 simple categories. Leave it alone, clean the pot, or repot it. And the surprising part is that the greenest looking pot is not always the one that needs the most intervention. Clear plastic pots are popular with Phalaenopsis growers for a good reason. They let you see part of the root system, notice how moisture is moving through the potting mix, and watch the pot change from freshly watered to progressively drier. But the same transparent wall that gives you that useful view also lets light reach a damp surface inside the pot. Add moisture, time, and a favorable environment, and a green film can begin to develop. That film may look alarming, especially if you have already lost an orchid to root rot, but color alone is not a diagnosis. A green pot can be a clue. It can tell you something about the environment around the roots. What it cannot do by itself is tell you that the roots are rotting. That distinction is the key to this entire video. Before we go through the 7 reasons, make sure you are actually looking at the same kind of problem. A thin green coating on the inside wall of a clear pot is very different from a collapsing root, a fuzzy growth on decaying organic matter, or a dark lesion spreading through plant tissue. You do not need to identify every microorganism under a microscope to make a useful care decision, but you do need to avoid treating every unusual color as the same problem. If the green material is mainly on the illuminated plastic and the roots behind it remain firm, that points you toward an environmental clue. If what you are seeing is associated with a bad smell, severely decomposed media, soft roots, or rapidly declining plant tissue, then you are no longer dealing with a simple cosmetic question. The plant is giving you multiple warning signs, and those deserve a closer inspection. This distinction matters because new orchid growers often make decisions from one visual cue. A leaf turns yellow, so they add fertilizer. A leaf wrinkles, so they add more water. A pot turns green, so they repot. But orchids rarely respond well to care based on one isolated symptom. A wrinkled leaf, for example, can result from a plant that is not receiving enough usable water, but that can happen because the pot is too dry or because damaged roots cannot absorb water from a wet pot. The solution depends on the cause. Green algae should be approached the same way. It starts the investigation. It does not finish it. The first reason algae appears is simple. Light is reaching the inside of the pot. Algae need light to grow, and a clear orchid pot can deliver that light directly to a surface that stays moist after watering. This is why you may notice a stronger green film on the side of the pot facing a bright window, while the shaded side stays clearer. It can also explain why one orchid in a transparent inner pot becomes green, while another plant hidden inside an opaque decorative pot does not show the same amount of visible growth. But this is where many beginners make their first wrong move. They see the green wall and decide the orchid must be getting too much light. Then they move the entire plant into a darker location. The problem is that you have changed the growing conditions for the orchid in order to solve a cosmetic issue on the pot. If the leaves and overall plant were receiving appropriate light before, reducing that light simply to keep the plastic clear may not be the best trade. So the first check is not, how do I stop all light from reaching this pot? The better question is the orchid itself receiving suitable light? And are the roots living in a healthy environment? If the roots are firm, the potting mix is still open and airy, and the pot moves through a reasonable wet-to-drier cycle, the presence of green growth on a light-exposed wall is not enough reason to disturb the plant. Light explains how algae can grow. It does not explain whether the root zone is healthy. And that brings us to the second reason, because 2 clear pots receiving the same light can turn green at very different speeds. The second reason is persistent moisture. Notice that I did not say simply too much watering. Those are not always the same thing. What matters to the root environment is not only how often water enters the pot, but how long water remains available in the mix. and how much air returns as the pot drains and dries. Two orchids can be watered on the same morning and still behave completely differently. One may be in coarse bark with many air spaces and a strong root system filling the pot. The other may be in fine, compacted material that holds moisture much longer in the center. One may sit in a warm room with gentle air movement. The other may sit inside a decorative outer pot with very little air exchange around the plastic inner pot. The calendar says both plants were watered once. The roots experience two very different environments. This is why algae can be useful as a clue without being a verdict. If the inside wall stays damp for long periods, that moisture can support more visible green growth. But the correct response is not automatically to stop watering until the orchid becomes dehydrated. Instead, observe the pot. After a thorough watering, does excess water drain freely? Does the mix gradually become less wet? Does the pot feel lighter as time passes? Do roots that were greener after watering become more silvery as they dry? You are looking for a pattern, not a fixed number of days. A watering schedule that works in one home may be wrong in another, because pot size, media, temperature, humidity, root mass, and air movement all change the drying rate. Before you change your watering routine, learn what your particular pot is doing between waterings. And here is an important retention point. A pot that stays moist longer than another pot is not automatically in crisis. Some media are designed to hold more moisture. Some plants have different root systems. What matters is whether the roots remain healthy in that environment. The danger comes when prolonged moisture is combined with a loss of air around the roots, deteriorating media, and roots that are beginning to collapse. That combination matters much more than the amount of algae you can see on the wall. To understand why, we need to look at the third reason: the age and condition of the bark. Fresh orchid bark is usually chunky enough to create spaces where air can move around the roots while still holding some moisture on and between the pieces. Over time, organic potting materials change. Bark can break down into smaller particles, become softer, settle, and pack more tightly. As that happens, a pot that once drained and aerated well may begin to hold water differently, especially toward the center and lower portion of the pot. This change is easy to miss because the orchid may still look presentable above the rim. You may see green algae and think the algae is the problem, when the more important story is that the root environment itself has changed. So check the bark, not just the plastic. Look through the sides if you can. Is the bark still coarse and recognizable, or has a lot of it become dark, fine, soft, and compacted? When you water, does water move quickly through the pot, or does the mix behave like a dense sponge? Can you see open spaces between pieces, or does the center look tightly packed? You do not need to tear the orchid apart just to answer every one of these questions. The goal is to collect clues. If the pot is green, but the bark remains structurally sound and the roots look healthy, I am far less concerned. If the pot is green and the bark is breaking down while the center remains wet for a long time, now the green color has become part of a larger pattern worth investigating. Another useful habit is to compare the outside of the pot with the center. The clear wall shows you only part of the story. The outer roots may receive more light and may dry faster than roots buried deep in the middle. A pot can look almost dry at the edge while the center remains much wetter, especially when fine material has accumulated there. This is one reason pot weight can be useful as an additional clue. A freshly watered pot is usually heavier, and as water leaves the media, it becomes lighter. You do not have to turn this into a laboratory measurement. Simply learning the feel of your own pot can help you notice when a container is staying heavy much longer than it used to. The same idea applies to root color. Visible roots can change appearance as moisture changes, but color should never be your only watering signal. A root pressed against the clear wall may look silver while the center of the pot is still moist. A green root may stay green longer because it is touching damp material. Combine what you see with the feel of the pot, the condition of the bark, the time since watering, and the environment in the room. The more clues you combine, the less likely you are to overcorrect based on a single patch of algae. This is the first point where green pot can shift from cosmetic issue to useful warning sign. Not because algae suddenly became toxic, but because it drew your attention to conditions that may no longer be ideal for the roots. And that leads directly to reason number 4, airflow and ventilation. Orchid roots are not ordinary houseplant roots living in dense garden soil. Phalaenopsis are commonly grown in porous media because their roots need both moisture and access to air. If the mix becomes too dense, or if the pot is enclosed in a way that slows air exchange and drying, the roots can spend too much time in a low-air, high-moisture environment. Airflow has several layers. There is air movement in the room. There is air movement around the outside of the pot. There is ventilation through holes and slots in the container. And there is the internal structure of the media, which determines whether air can occupy spaces around the roots after excess water drains away. You can have a fan somewhere in the room and still have a dense, suffocating center inside a pot. You can also have a clear inner pot with good drainage that dries normally, even though the outside wall has a lot of algae. That is why simply looking at the green surface never tells the whole story. Pay special attention if your orchid sits inside a decorative cache pot. Decorative outer pots are not automatically bad. They are extremely common and they can be used successfully. But ask what happens after watering. Does water collect in the bottom of the outer pot? Is the clear inner pot left standing in that water? Is there space for air around it? Do you remove it, drain it thoroughly, and return it only after excess water is gone? The important issue is not whether the outer pot is pretty or opaque. The issue is whether the setup allows the root zone to drain and breathe. If the environment remains wet and stagnant for too long, changing that environment matters more than scrubbing the green film from the plastic. Now we reach the comparison that changes how I want you to look at algae. Imagine 2 Phalaenopsis orchids sitting side by side. The first pot is ugly by cosmetic standards. Green algae covers a large part of the clear wall, but when you look carefully, the roots are firm and plump. Several roots are green after watering and become more silvery as they dry. The bark is still chunky. Water runs through the pot freely, and the center does not remain swampy. The plant is holding its leaves normally and showing active root tips. The second orchid has a much cleaner looking pot. There is only a small amount of green on the plastic. At first glance, it looks better, but the bark in the center has broken into fine material. The pot feels heavy for a long time after watering. Some roots are brown, flattened, hollow, or mushy, and air spaces through the mix have become much smaller. If I judged those 2 orchids by the color of the pot alone, I would choose the wrong plant to repot. The greener pot may actually be the one I am less worried about. That is the twist many new growers miss. Appearance can attract your attention, but root condition has to guide the decision. This is why clear pots are useful even when they become green. They encourage you to look deeper. Do not ask only, how much algae do I have? Ask, what are the roots underneath it telling me? Healthy Phalaenopsis roots are generally firm and substantial rather than soft and collapsing. Depending on moisture and light, visible roots may look greener when wet and paler, whitish, or silvery when drier. Active growing tips can appear bright and fresh. A root does not have to be a perfect, uniform green to be alive, and a strange color by itself is not enough reason to cut. The texture matters. A root that feels firm and intact deserves a very different judgment from one whose outer tissue is mushy, slipping away, or collapsed around a thin inner strand. Dead or badly damaged roots can also become hollow or papery. This is why cutting every root that looks brown is a mistake. Color can be stained by bark, fertilizer residue, age, or lighting. Structure tells you more. If you cannot see enough because the algae is dense, that may be a perfectly reasonable reason to clean the pot at an appropriate time. Cleaning can restore visibility. What it should not do is turn into an emergency root surgery when the plant otherwise looks stable. If you are not already due for repotting and the media is healthy, you may decide simply to monitor the plant until a normal repotting opportunity. If you do repot because the media is deteriorated or the roots are failing, then use that opportunity to inspect the root system carefully and remove only roots that are truly dead or rotted, while preserving firm, living roots. The goal is not to make the root system look cosmetically perfect. The goal is to leave the orchid with as much functioning root tissue as possible. There is also a practical reason not to react too quickly. Every time you remove a Phalaenopsis from its pot, you risk breaking or bruising roots that were functioning perfectly well. Repotting is an important tool, but it is not a cleaning ritual that has to happen every time the plastic looks unattractive. If the medium is fresh enough, drainage is good, and the plant is actively using its root system, preserving that stability can be more valuable than achieving a spotless pot. On the other hand, if the mix has broken down or roots are failing, delaying a needed repot simply because the plant is flowering or because you do not want to disturb it can also be the wrong choice. Routine repotting is often easiest around the period after flowering or as new root activity begins, but root health takes priority when the current media are no longer working. That is why I like to separate routine repotting from corrective repotting. Routine repotting is maintenance, replacing aging media before it becomes a serious problem, choosing an appropriate pot, and giving new roots a fresh, porous environment. Corrective repotting is different. You are responding to evidence that the present root zone is failing, such as decomposed media, poor drainage, or substantial root loss. Green algae by itself does not automatically place a plant in the corrective category. It only tells you to look closely enough to decide which category you are actually in. Reason number 5 is fertilizer and mineral residue. This one needs a careful explanation because it is easy to oversimplify. Fertilizer does not mean your orchid pot will automatically turn green, and algae does not prove that you are over-fertilizing, but a moist, illuminated surface with nutrients available can support more biological growth than the same surface without those conditions. At the same time, mineral and fertilizer salts can accumulate in potting media and on pots over time. That buildup can matter to roots, especially if the concentration becomes high. So once again, the green layer is not necessarily the most important thing you are seeing. Look for crusty white or tan deposits on the rim, the drainage holes, the bark, or the surface of the pot. Think about your watering water and your fertilizing routine. If you fertilize regularly, periodic thorough watering that lets water run freely through the pot can help flush accumulated salts from the mix. The point is not to flood a pot that cannot drain. The point is that a properly potted orchid should allow water to pass through, and thorough drainage gives you useful information about whether the media has become too dense. If water does not move through the pot readily, that is a reason to inspect the structure of the mix. A green wall may be visually dramatic, but a dense, salt-loaded, poorly aerated root zone is the condition I would take more seriously. Do not respond to algae by suddenly doubling fertilizer because you think the plant needs to outgrow it. And do not stop feeding forever because you assume fertilizer caused the green color. Keep the diagnosis tied to the orchid. Is it in active growth? Are roots healthy? Is the media still functional? Is your fertilizer appropriate and used according to its label and your growing conditions? The goal is balanced care. Algae is not a fertilizer meter. Reason number 6 is window placement. A Phalaenopsis sitting near a bright window can give algae exactly what it wants: light on a moist, transparent wall. This often creates an interesting pattern. The side facing the window may be much greener than the side facing the room. That tells you light is part of the algae story. It does not automatically tell you to move the orchid away from useful light. Phalaenopsis still need adequate light for healthy growth and flowering. A clean pot is not a victory if you achieve it by placing the plant in conditions too dim for the orchid to perform well. Instead of chasing a perfectly clear pot, manage the whole growing environment. If the light is appropriate for the plant and the leaves are not being scorched, keep your attention on root health, moisture, and ventilation. If you use an opaque decorative outer pot, remember that it changes what reaches the clear inner pot and may also change airflow around it. That can reduce visible algae, but it can also slow drying if the fit is tight and air exchange is poor. There is always a trade-off to consider. We are not designing a display case for clean plastic. We are designing a root environment that works. This brings us to reason number 7, and this is the one that finally determines whether I become concerned. The root zone stays wet for too long relative to the needs of the plant and the conditions around it. I want to be precise here. Water itself is not the enemy. Orchid roots need water. The problem is a root environment that remains overly wet while air movement through the media has fallen, especially when organic media are decomposing. That combination can damage roots and make it harder for the plant to take up water effectively, even though the pot looks wet. This is why an orchid with damaged roots can develop limp or wrinkled leaves and still be sitting in wet media. Adding more water does not repair roots that can no longer function. So this final check combines everything we have discussed. First, look at the roots you can see. Are they mostly firm and intact, or are significant sections collapsing, hollow, or mushy? Second, evaluate the media. Is it still coarse and open, or broken down and compacted? Third, watch drainage. Does water flow through freely? Fourth, follow the drying pattern over time instead of relying on the calendar. Fifth, consider the pot setup. Is the inner pot able to drain completely, or is it sitting in retained water inside a decorative container? Sixth, consider air movement. Is the root zone getting a chance to re-aerate as excess water leaves? And seventh, consider the plant itself. Are leaves firm and growth progressing, or is the orchid declining despite the pot remaining moist? One more thing. Cleaning the visible algae and fixing the conditions that encourage it are not the same task. You can wipe a surface clean and still have a pot that stays wet too long, just as you can leave some green staining in place while maintaining a healthy root zone. That is why I would not make strong chemicals the center of this problem. If cleaning is needed, keep the response simple and focused on the container, and avoid exposing living roots to unnecessary treatments. The long-term solution is always the growing environment. Suitable media, free drainage, appropriate watering, enough air around the roots, and light that serves the orchid rather than a spotless piece of plastic. Now we can finally make the decision. Category 1 is ignore it. And by ignore it, I do not mean stop observing the plant. I mean do not disturb a healthy orchid only because the plastic is green. If the roots look firm, the media remains structurally sound. Drainage is good, the pot moves through an appropriate moisture cycle, and the plant appears stable. Algae may be mainly a cosmetic issue. Continue monitoring. Keep watering based on the condition of the media and roots, not based on panic. Keep giving the orchid suitable light. There is no prize for having the cleanest clear pot if the orchid is growing well. Category 2 is clean it. This is appropriate when the green layer has become so dense that you can no longer see enough of the root system, or when you simply want to clean a pot for appearance and observation. If the orchid is otherwise healthy and not due for repotting, cleaning does not have to become a major intervention. Depending on the setup, you may clean accessible outer surfaces, clean the decorative container, or wait until the next appropriate repotting opportunity to clean or replace the inner pot without repeatedly disturbing the root system. If you remove the plant during a necessary repot, use a clean pot and fresh suitable media. The key is proportional response. A cosmetic problem deserves a cosmetic solution unless the evidence points to a root zone problem. Category 3 is repot it. This is where the decision should be based on the root environment, not the algae itself. Repotting becomes reasonable when the media has clearly broken down, drainage and aeration have deteriorated, the root system shows meaningful decline, the plant has outgrown the container, or the current setup is keeping the roots in conditions that are no longer working. When you repot a Phalaenopsis, use a fresh, porous orchid medium suited to your home and watering habits. Keep healthy roots as intact as possible. Remove dead or rotted roots carefully, rather than cutting aggressively for appearance. And choose a pot that supports drainage and air around the root zone without being excessively oversized. This is also the moment to avoid a few common mistakes. Do not repot a stable plant simply because you dislike the green color. Do not cut every brown or stained root. Do not move a healthy orchid into deep shade just to prevent algae. Do not follow a rigid watering schedule without checking how quickly your own pot dries. Do not leave the inner pot standing in water collected inside a cassia pot. And do not assume a wet-looking pot means a thirsty, wrinkled orchid needs even more water before you inspect the roots. Whenever the top of the plant and the moisture in the pot seem to tell conflicting stories, check the root system before making a major change. There is one more subtle lesson here. Algae can actually help train you to become a better observer. It makes you notice which side of the pot receives light. It makes you compare drying speed between plants. It makes you inspect the bark. It makes you think about air spaces, drainage, mineral buildup, and root texture. Those are all more useful skills than memorizing a rule such as green pot equals overwatering. Orchid care becomes easier when you stop treating every symptom as a single diagnosis and start combining clues. So, the next time you pick up a Phalaenopsis and see a wall of green inside the clear pot, do not panic and do not ignore it blindly. Use it as a signal to look closer. Check the roots, check the bark, check how long the pot stays wet. Check how freely it drains and how much air reaches the root zone. Check whether mineral residue is building up and whether window light is simply making the algae more visible. Then make the smallest intervention that actually solves the real problem. If the roots are healthy and the media is functioning well, leave the plant alone and keep watching it. If the algae is only blocking your view, clean when practical. If the media has deteriorated and the roots are declining, repot because the root environment needs correcting, not because the plastic turned green. That one distinction can prevent both unnecessary repotting and dangerous neglect. Treat algae as a clue, not a diagnosis. The health of the roots matters more than the color of the pot. Once you learn to read the roots, the bark, the airflow, and the drying pattern together, a green orchid pot becomes much less mysterious. Thanks for watching. And if this helped you understand what is happening inside your orchid pot, subscribe for more practical orchid care, give the video a like, and tell me in the comments whether you usually clean green pots, ignore them, or use them as a signal to inspect the roots.